Take a step on the road to fun. Take a step on the road into nature. Take a step on the road into the past. Take a step on the road to sharing powerful stories. Take a step on the road to experiencing big ideas. Take a step with Humanities on the Road as speakers from the Pennsylvania Humanities Council take you on a journey through history, literature, the arts, and the world around you. Learn more about Humanities on the Road and discover why the humanities are important to you at humanitiesontheroad.org. Welcome to Humanities on the Road. Today we're at the Laurel Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia. Founded in 1836, Laurel Hill Cemetery is located on the scenic banks of the Schuylkill River. It is the first cemetery in the United States to be honored with the designation of National Historic Landmark. Laurel Hill is the final resting place for over 40 Union and Confederate generals, hundreds of Civil War civilians, surgeons, and nurses. Hello everyone, I'm Tracy Matisak. Humanities on the Road is a wonderful opportunity for audiences all over Pennsylvania to explore history and the arts and the ideas that shape our world. And as part of today's program, we're going to ask what ordinary women did to try to keep things from falling apart as the Civil War came home. Our special guest, Judy Giesberg, is an associate professor of history at Villanova University, and she has been interested in the lives of ordinary people from the Civil War since her graduate school days. Her most recent book is titled Army at Home: Women and the Civil War on the Northern Homefront. So please join me now as we welcome Judy Giesberg for Lincoln and the Widow Bixby. Here's Judy.
In Steven Spielberg's 1998 film Saving Private Ryan, immediately following a series of harrowing battlefield scenes for which the film received critical acclaim, cameras switch abruptly to the scene of a large room full of women curved over typewriters, typing out letters of sympathy dictated by military commanders in the field. Some of the letters are awkward, others are eloquent, all of them are genuine. The scene then moves from the chattering typewriters and the overlapping narratives of young men cut down in battle, so many of them, to focus in on one woman typing out a letter to a Mrs. Margaret Ryan of Iowa. A quick-thinking supervisor recognizes something important about this one letter among the many. It's the third such letter she's seen addressed to Mrs. Ryan that day. The supervisor assembles the condolence letters describing the deaths of 3 of Mrs. Ryan's sons and sends them up the chain of command. Here, Saving Private Ryan briefly transports viewers back in time to consider how wartime sacrifice connects Americans of one generation to those of another. Examining the 3 letters on his desk, General George C. Marshall retrieves a book, presumably a Bible, from his desk and pulls out a piece of paper. Marshall begins to read from that paper, but then he finishes by reciting the famous words from memory. Dear Madam, I've been shown in the files of the War Department a statement of the Adjutant General of Massachusetts that you are the mother of 5 sons who have died gloriously on the field of battle. I feel how weak and fruitless must be any word of mine which should attempt to beguile you from a grief of a loss so overwhelming. But I cannot refrain from tendering you the consolation that may be found in the thanks of the Republic they died to save. I pray that our Heavenly Father may assuage the anguish of your bereavement and leave you only the cherished memory of the loved and lost, and the solemn pride that must be yours to have laid so costly a sacrifice upon the altar of freedom. Yours very sincerely and respectfully, A. Lincoln. Having recited the words of Abraham Lincoln's November 1864 letter to the widow Bixby, Spielberg then jolts viewers back to the 20th century. Marshall makes two decisions that serve as a way to measure the distance between these two centuries. First, Marshall dispatches an Army representative to deliver the news to Mrs. Ryan in person, something that rarely happened in the 19th century. And second, he issues orders to send a group of soldiers to rescue the woman's last surviving son, James Francis Ryan, missing in action somewhere in the French countryside. Though the end of the movie is still 2 hours away at this time, we know as viewers that Mrs. Ryan will have her son back home again. But what else do we know about the fictional Mrs. Margaret Ryan? Because the letters are addressed to her instead of her husband, and because we see her alone in her rural home, we assume that she is a widow. She looks to be perhaps in her 60s. In the movie, Mrs. Ryan makes really only a brief appearance, collapsing on her front porch when she hears the news of her son's deaths. The movie ends with Mrs. Ryan's one surviving son, now elderly, visiting the grave of the man who saved him, Captain Miller, played by Tom Hanks. We can assume that James Ryan visits the graves of his brothers and his mother and father, presumably. We can even imagine perhaps a younger Private Ryan visiting graves with his mother. But with Spielberg really chiefly interested in exploring the bonds of affection that develop between men on the battlefield, the tragic Mrs. Ryan really serves as a backdrop for the sacrifices of Captain Miller, aka Tom Hanks, and the young men who die on this mission of mercy. We can imagine perhaps Mrs. Ryan's relief when her one son returns, but we also wonder how that relief mixes with grief at the loss of her other sons. How do women and men who lose their sons and today their daughters make sense of this kind of sacrifice? How do they make peace with this kind of loss? These are some of the questions that we'll look at today as we take a closer look at that famous letter that, like Mrs. Ryan, really makes only a cameo appearance in this film. A letter sent by a grieving president to a bereaved mother during the United States Civil War. One that seems to speak to us across generations, but one that we interestingly know still very little about. So let's begin with taking a little closer look at that letter. And then later we'll look at Mrs. Bixby a little closer. Referred to alternately as the most famous condolence letter and Lincoln's letter to the widow Bixby, mystery has shrouded many things about the letter President Lincoln wrote to Lydia Bixby during the Civil War. Scholars have argued about the authorship of the letter, and no one has been able to account for the original letter's whereabouts. Scholars have also argued fiercely about how many of those 5 sons actually died on the battlefield. But no one doubts that the emotions expressed in the letter are Lincoln's. In a few short words, the letter captured Lincoln's own experience of loss, and also what we know about his deeply troubled conscience at the mounting battlefield casualties by 1864. Because of the careful work of a number of historians, we know how the news about Lydia Bixby reached the president's desk. On September 24th, 1864, William Schuyler, Adjutant General of Massachusetts, wrote a letter to Governor John Andrew, in which he included the following information. About 10 days ago, Mrs. Bixby came to my office and showed me 5 letters from 5 different company commanders, and each letter informed the poor woman of the death of one of her sons. She had 5. Her last remaining son was recently killed on the Weldon Railroad. Schuyler closed his letter to Governor Andrew exclaiming, "Mrs. Bixby is the best specimen of a true-hearted Union woman I have yet seen." Andrew then addressed himself to Secretary of War Edwin Stanton on the same day, requesting a letter from the president, taking notice of a noble mother of 5 dead heroes, so well deserved, as he described Bixby. The Adjutant General then wrote to Mrs. Bixby, requesting the names, regiments, and circumstances of her sons' deaths, so that he could then pass this information along to Stanton. Stanton, too, seems to have done some of his own fact-checking, for historians found that the Secretary of War pulled the pension application that Lydia Bixby filed on May 3rd, 1863, upon the death at Fredericksburg of her son Charles. Having assembled the necessary information, Lincoln then wrote the letter on November 21st, 1864. With an eye to its significance, Schuyler delivered the letter to Lydia Bixby in person, but first he gave copies to Boston's newspapers. Appropriately, the papers published the letter the day after Thanksgiving. Although Schuyler was likely concerned about establishing his state's bragging rights when he published Lincoln's letter, as it turned out, the decision to give a copy of the letter to the papers was prescient. The original letter vanished along with its recipient, and along with it, any hopes of solving the mystery that has surrounded it since. We'll get to that in just a second. But first, it pays to remember a couple of things. That even though his son Willie had died 2 years previously in 1862, and it had been 14 years since Eddie's death in 1850, another one of Lincoln's sons who died young, Lincoln still grieved the loss of both of these sons and likely knew something of what he spoke when he addressed himself to Lydia Bixby. And also by 1864, Lincoln showed obvious outward signs of the inner anguish he felt at the mounting casualties of war. Lincoln managed to communicate these emotions in just a few short words, and that alone can explain the continued interest in this letter. But there are questions, and these questions began immediately, and they began in the newspapers. Within days of publication of Lincoln's letter, the Liberator, William Lloyd Garrison's abolitionist paper, noted that one of Lydia Bixby's 5 sons, George Bixby, presumed dead, was being held as prisoner of war. This must have been welcome news for Mrs. Bixby, who had mourned his death for more than a year. Although from what we know about Civil War prisons, this was not the end of her worries about George. Opposition papers took the opportunity of the published letter to criticize Lincoln for not sending his son Robert into the army. "Why is it that the sons of laboring man get sent to the field?" asked Boston's New Age newspaper, known for its allegiance to the Democratic Party, while Robert remained at Harvard. "Are the sons of the rail splitter porcelain and these others common clay?" For the record, Robert was permitted to enlist in January of 1865, serving an administrative position under Grant. The papers did not forget the letter even after Lincoln's death. In fact, they became even more interested in it after Lincoln's untimely death. The letter was published several times at the end of the 19th century and then appeared again in the early 20th century, being published in full in several newspapers throughout the country. At the Lincoln Centennial in 1909, people once again took interest in the letter, and it was again published, and people began to talk about it again. The letter was reprinted many times throughout the 20th century, and even after then, Centennial died down. The Bixby letter continued to spark interest and even some controversy in the newspapers. The letter was printed so often, in fact, that we are not surprised to read in the papers